So as we begin, Seth, it's probably helpful for people to get to know you a little bit better. Tell us a bit about yourself, and why we might have asked you particularly around this topic. What you think you offer in this space.
Okay. Well, I'm originally from the Pacific. I'm Rotuman by ethnicity, and Rotuma is a little island northwest of Fiji. During the height of British colonisation, and there are multiple perspectives on this, but the short story is that after the great, what they call the Great War in Rotuma, which is a very small island of 48 square miles, you wouldn't think that you'd have a great war or a conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. Apparently the Protestants won and they got the better side of the island, and the Catholics got the short end of the stick and got the not so nice side of the island. But what happened after that was the chiefs felt that they needed to cede this tiny little island to the British, and they did. And the British decided that administratively it would be better if Fiji was annexed to as part of, if Rotuma was annexed as part of Fiji. So administratively from that point, and I'm very conscious that, we have a prominent historian here of the Pacific, and I can't remember my dates, sorry. But it was the late 1880s where Rotuma became part of Fiji, and that was more an administrative decision. Culture-wise, we're very different. So, it's kind of like, I think this kind of a similar thing happened with Israel and Palestine, as they say. Someone thought it was a good idea, and they did it. So, so ever since the late 1880s, we've been part of Fiji. I also grew up in a time where, a legacy of colonisation and Christian mission, that's part of my history. It's also part of what I embody, because in that interaction and encounter, there are many kind of belief systems and ideologies that became part of who I am. And so if we're looking at racism, then I grew up with the belief that in order to be Christian, you must first be westernized, civilized. So it wasn't really about the gospel of Jesus and the transformation that comes from that. It was being transformed, using that word, into a particular culture and understanding in which people like me with coloured bodies didn't quite make it because there was a hierarchy of race. So that kind of played out both in theology and in understanding of Christian mission, and it's a understanding that continues to play out to this day. So I think, for me, the part of my Christian journey is also about decolonising myself, and I'm talking as an individual, and the decolonisation of my mind, because and this is a mystery to me, but it's so powerful. Something happened in the encounter, colonial encounter between colonisers and the people that were being colonised. And although we talk a lot about decolonising today, I don't think we actually quite get to that deep part that actually needs the transformation. I think a lot of it is a surface kind of decolonising, because we keep defaulting to the colonizer's ideology or theology or whatever, or philosophy, whatever that is. So that's a kind of a long-winded answer to what brings me into this space. And in connection to that is part of the decolonizing process is about liberation and about liberation theology.
And I guess from a Uniting Church perspective, you're also an ordained minister in the Uniting Church, and you are a theologian of the Uniting Church, and this is kind of some of the areas that you teach in as well, and have spoken into in a variety of different spaces within the church as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we started to unpack this a little bit, but I think as we talk about the concepts of racism and liberation theology, I'm wondering if you have a tweet-sized version of definition of both of those things. Well, how would you sort of name the concept of racism? How would you name liberation theology?
Okay, so, like in summary, racism is any belief or practice or policy that actually marginalizes, oppresses, suppresses any particular group of people based on race. That's the broad definition. In terms of liberation theology, in a nutshell, it is about the liberation of the oppressed and the poor. So people like from the Catholic tradition, like Leonardo Boff and the father of who we dub of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, it's about a preferential option for the poor. It's not only just that preferential option, it's also about political liberation of the poor and justice for all who are marginalised or oppressed or pushed to the margins that someone who has power or a group that has power has kind of created. So basically, I mean, that's in its simplest sense, that's what it is. Racism is the exclusion based on race, and it's usually then you ask, well, who's doing the excluding? And liberation theology or understanding is about the political and socio-economical liberation of those who find themselves unfairly pushed to a particular margin.
So on that idea of the liberation for the poor and marginalised, how does that work for us in that sense of participating or having an interest in liberation theology when in a lot of ways we'd be coming at it from a position of privilege already? How does that sort of play out? Because again, it sort of it has been more of a grassroots theology that's come from the margins as well. What does it mean for those of us who are not in that space?
Yeah, well, I want to come at it from using the lens of intersectionality, which kind of enables us to actually see, well, let's stay with racism, but to actually see racism from different perspectives and different standpoints. Because, although we may be privileged and we're not in Latin America, where there is, where where the poor are tangible and in your face. The poor are here in Australia, it's just that I think we mask it better or we don't go out to the places where they are. So to look at it from an intersectional kind of level is to recognise, and this is, to recognise our own place and complicity in using racism, in participating in racism. And sometimes that can be unintentional or intentional. Because in Australia, and I would say perhaps in this congregation, many of us come from privileged positions, but at the same time, because we are of a particular race or a particular sexuality or socio-economic position, in different spaces, those things can also marginalise us. And we can also kind of feel marginalisation or oppression or racism simply because we've got that, we kind of wear that. So like for myself and for Rads, if I can include her, we're brown bodies. So immediately when we go into certain spaces, we kind of, know instantly whether or not it's going to be a marginalising space or not. But because we're educated and we're ministers and we have the Rev title, we can go into other spaces and find that we have a lot of power. So my question is always around, paying attention and being aware of our particular socio-political or economical location in every place that we go, and understanding where we might find ourselves in that particular place. And the thing is to also acknowledge all the time or be aware of our own personal privilege and power. Because I have it. I may be a coloured body, but I have it because there are certain factors, intersecting factors that contribute to my body that kind of makes me, in some spaces, a powerful and privileged person, and I need to acknowledge that. Because in some cases, I can be complicit in marginalising or oppressing someone else, and that could be another brown body. So I think it's recognising your location and also the power and privilege that comes with that, that's attached to your location and your body.
And I think that's a really good segue into our first question that we had from a member of the congregation around the church and the church's, particularly the church's role in racism past and ongoing. Like, how do we grapple with, make amends for, and address that sense of racism as part of the church's effectively identity, I guess? What do we do with that?
Yeah. The first thing I want to say to that is, well, the question I ask is who has the power in this particular space? The thing about racism is that, if we are honest with ourselves, we're all kind of racist to a certain point. Like, let me use the example. We actually are racist, towards the Tongans or the Samoans or we kind of have that in our psyche. The thing about racism in this context, and I think in a global kind of context, is the default to whiteness. So I like to probably explore and think about racism in terms of the concept of whiteness, but whiteness not as colour, whiteness as ideology. Because I think that in the colonial process, that's where the idea and the concept of whiteness was embedded. And initially, that was the case, that it was white bodies perpetuating this oppression. But the colonial encounter has been so powerful that what's happened with the colonised is the imposition of another kind of ideology, and that ideology is is whiteness, in terms of all the power and privilege that is attached to that. So it's not specifically and always a skin colour issue. It's also like an embodied idea or ideology of thinking whiteness, where we default, and we do this all the time, I do it all the time, where we default to a white way of thinking, which is attached to power and privilege. So therefore, it's not just white people perpetuating racism, it's also coloured bodies being complicit in perpetuating racism because they've embodied that whiteness ideology, and therefore they live their lives sort of doing what colonisation kind of did in terms of power and marginalisation and oppression. So, so it is, I guess it's, again, being aware, it's not so much white and therefore all white people are racist. I mean, that's the simple, it's really to really simplify what it is. But it's also to recognise that those of us who are not white also perpetuate racism simply because we have not decolonised or become aware that we too default to a white way of doing things. That's related to colonisation. And that is what we need to kind of continue to decenter and deconstruct, because it comes into play all the time. So I can say this, I can say, well, sometimes my, Pacifica people actually act like white, powerful men in how they go about business or do ministry, etc., etc. And that's simply because we've taken on a white kind of mentality that's attached to power and privilege.
I think, and
Does that answer your question, or did I just
no, I did think so. I think there's obviously more to go into, I guess, than what are the. I mean, one of the things that Leichhardt sort of hopes for itself is that we are an anti-racist church,
Yes.
so that
Yeah.
not just so it's an active engagement with the idea about being anti-racist. I guess it's what does that actually look like from your experience as a church that is made up of different coloured bodies and different experiences, and how do we live that out effectively?
Yeah, well, one of the things I should start with is actually what Rads wrote, that document on anti-racist worship. That's a start. I mean, because worship is actually the centre of all that we do. So anti-racist strategies is about deactivating all those aspects of racism that come into play that continue to actually push people to the margins or to keep them oppressed. So what does it look like? That's the hard bit. Because on the one level, we're also needing to, and again I come back to decentering this sense of whiteness, this concept of white. And I'm sorry I'm using whiteness, but know that I mean that I'm actually talking more about a belief system and an ideology that's been embedded in our institutions, that's actually been structurally embedded. And that's it's not just personal, it's also institutional and structural. That has also infected our theology. And some of our theologies, from historically, have to own are racist. So I think that part of it is actually accepting the reality for what it is, rather than making excuses for what it's not. So there's a level, I think, of honesty and courage in this conversation, because what tends to happen, I think, when we talk about racism is we start going into the blaming game, because, those of us on the receiving end are very hurt and still vulnerable. And some of us still want to lash out, right? Because it's like, I want to tell my story because this is what happened to me. But I think it's about sort of coming to the conversation with a level of vulnerability and honesty and authenticity to actually say, this is a cancer that continues to exist in our midst. We are all part of the solution, and part of it is having conversations together to find practical ways. And, we don't have to go and save the world. It's not going to happen. I mean, look, we've got Trump, and I'm already in despair about what's, the future of our world at the moment. But we find ways of doing what we can where we are, and I think that's where it starts. And that's why I began with the document that Rads wrote on anti-racist worship, because that's a practical, tangible way of being anti-racist. And then it's, for me, it's theological education and our formation, which are both, they are things that it's not separate. I think the church has kind of somehow understood formation and theological formation as two separate tracks, but they're not. They actually have to be integrated, because it's not just the development of the academic mind. So for me, in terms of theology, it's saying is, well, what aspects of our education, our theological education, that we need to seriously start looking at changing. So that comes, one is pedagogy. What's at the basis of our philosophy of theological education is one. And the other side of that is the methodology. How are we teaching theology, and what is our curriculum? So what are the different things that we are, needing to address in our curriculum that can help to be part of being anti-racist? And, of course, we're forming leaders, so that's, a good start. So I guess in summary, it's to say, acknowledge where we are at, and then find ways, practical ways of actually doing things that where we have power and control to change, and start from there. Rather than going for the big issues, or rather than just theologizing and, thinking about it and talking about and having talk fests that don't actually go anywhere. But I also want to add to that is I think that work of anti-racism is really tough work, because not only are we wanting to change a system, we're also wanting to change ourselves. And that's where it gets hard. And my favourite thing is to say, I think at the end of the day, it's always about our power and privilege. What is it that we're willing to give up to allow spaces for others, or to open up the circle that we are part of? And that's I think, very hard thing to do for many of us. Because we love our privileges, don't we, and our benefits that come from that.
I've got one more question before I'm going to come to you all, so get ready for that. I think this one really helps wrestle with, I guess, one of the big symptoms of that whiteness that is embedded in the way we think about Christianity. And the question comes as, I have a specific concern about depictions of Jesus as white. My understanding is that the myth of white Jesus has historically been connected to the church, linking Christianity with white supremacy and vice versa. If so, is it important that we actively challenge these kinds of depictions?
Absolutely, yes. And and this is why I was saying, in terms of theology, that's one of the big examples, is how Jesus has been portrayed. I grew up in the Pacific, that's all I saw. So, embarrassingly, until I started theological education, I truly believed that Jesus was a blue-eyed, blonde, white male. And when I found out that this Jesus, was an Arab, a Jew, I went, oh my gosh, that means he is a brown body. So, of course we need to, and I mean, this is why we've got subjects, on Christologies in context, is basically looking at images of Jesus in different cultures, or how Jesus can be understood in the language and in the culture of particular contexts. So when we come to looking at decolonizing our subjects or theology, that's one of them. And this is what I mean about our theologies are actually racist. And one of them is because we've been portraying a white Jesus. And it's a white Jesus that's connected to race ideology, of actually saying that, if Jesus is white, the superior race is white, is a white body. So, for example, the doctrine of discovery is one of those, I just think, oh my goodness, it's probably one of the scourges in our Christian history and theology, because it brought together conveniently and powerfully the 3 C's of what I call Christianity, colonialism, and capitalism. So, and this undergirded the doctrine of discovery and colonization in all different parts of the world. And it was because, it was framed within a theological and spiritual framework. So, or theology. So how could you beat that? Then, when you see that Jesus is white and you look at the doctrine of incarnation, what does that say to you as a coloured body? Or if you're not white? Well, if Jesus is a white male, then God must be white. Even though that's not meant to be. God is mystery and beyond gender or race. But that's the kind of connections that are being made. So when you continue to see images of Jesus, in paintings and depicted as the white, blonde, blue-eyed male, that really consolidates the idea that if you are not white, you are definitely second best. So therefore, that kind of theology validates the civilizing missions, not Christian mission or the Missio Dei, civilizing missions, because they were also attached to colonial ideology. So these are the things, if we're doing this anti-racist kind of work, these are the things that we are needing to unpack and unravel and separate. Because otherwise they, continue to perpetuate how we think of ourselves and others.
I certainly remember growing up with the experiences of white Jesus and not really questioning that in any way, shape or form. And it wasn't until I went to the Philippines and and seeing the religious art in Philippines, which is particularly Catholic, so huge on iconography and that, and still for the majority seeing white Jesus in that space where starting to think, oh, this is kind of odd. And then seeing one particularly church that actually had black Jesus there and going, whoa, what is this? And then that sort of question going, hey, what's going on here? And that was kind of the turning point for me of going, there's something messed up here that we're not questioning, particularly from my position of white privilege. That was, again, that experience of seeing different coloured bodies having a Jesus that is not of their own. There's something incredibly powerful being able to identify with Jesus as someone that looks like you, I guess, is the point, but that's been done to the point of exclusion within the whites. That Jesus is only white is where it becomes hugely problematic, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the dominant image, right? So then after a while you kind of believe, well, that's it. And you stop, as you say, you don't question it because it's become the norm. And that's exactly how racism works. It's like, that's the norm. So, you go, oh, it's okay. The other thing too is, is around, it's not about making Jesus in your own image. I mean, this is, that's a question that's kind of come up in saying, yeah, but then you got all different coloured Jesuses, But I think it's the very thing that you're saying, Adrian. It's about being able to connect and kind of understand that God actually is a representation of all bodies. So it's not to say that Jesus is a black African male or, because historically Jesus was a Jew. So that's a fact, right? So, that's where we begin, but it's also where we can, sort of launch off and say, well, there are other depictions of Jesus, because if we believe that our culture, and this is where we go into anthropology, is that if we believe that our cultures are a gift from God, then it would be true to say that revelation is also found in each of our cultures. That, of course, needs to be continually, tested against the, the four sources of our doing theology.
Over to you all. You might have something that's come up already that you want to ask for a bit more detail on, or you might have something completely different that you would like to hear Seth share their thoughts on. But if you have a question, raise your hand. Radhika has the mic. She'll bring it around. We've got Alex, and then we'll go John.
I'll go, and then I'll pass off to Alex.
Rads is also abusing the power of holding the microphone.
I've got the mic, and you can all listen to me. Seth, I imagine you roll your eyes in the way that I do at the comments like, I don't see skin colour. Like, when I see you, I don't see skin colour.
Yeah.
But I wonder how you feel about the notion that God also does not see race, kind of maybe quoting the, in Christ there is no longer Jew or Gentile. Does race matter to God?
Oh, well, I can't answer for God. Well, I mean, I come back to, I guess, the understanding of diversity, and that if we are, going back to the creation story, in terms of our diversity is created in God's image, and although it was the creation, it includes us. It's also to say, again, that in our differences, and if we believe that culture is a gift of God, then for sure I'd say, yeah, it does matter. Because I don't believe that God created homogeneity. Otherwise, we'd all be one skin colour and live with just, they wouldn't be, I don't think we'd be able to distinguish one from the other. So the fact that we are all made different means that diversity race does matter to God. It's what we do with that. If we make race or culture our idol, then we've got a problem, because then we're insisting on the purity of our own difference and our own race. And I don't think that that's what God had intended. And yes, I think we always hold a balance between our differences and also our unity. So, and I think that's a fine balance we walk on, it's like a tightrope all the time, because our unity is in Christ. And so is our diversity. Our diversity is a gift. So I think in short I'd say, it does matter. And, in terms of what does it mean to be made in God's image? Well, we just get diversity in the Genesis story. So diversity does matter. Does that answer your question? I had another thread of thought and it's gone. Mustn't be important.
Alex.
Hi, Seth. So my question is about the word race and how we use it. And it's been on my mind a lot lately with the ABC firing or sacking of Antoinette Lattouf, and ABC having to prove that there is a Lebanese race, which is not something that I had kind of, I guess, conceptually thought about. And I suppose that the concept of race seems to change and morph, and what we consider white now is not what we've always considered white, and people who are now considered white people historically weren't always considered white people. So I guess from your perspective, how do you define race, and is it as black and white as
No.
How do we define it, and how can we define it in a way that I guess is useful? I guess that's a useful definition of race, the one that isn't just going to be kind of smacked down by people saying, oh well, you can't be racist towards someone who's Muslim because Islam isn't a race. And I hear that in my work context. My former work context, I used to hear that a lot. So what is a definition of race that is inclusive but also useful?
I think we're still going on that journey. The thing to say is that race is a socially constructed concept. So, going back to where you're saying in our history, it was constructed for the purpose of actually, of actually arguing for or validating a particular race in terms of the others. So it was really about a hierarchy of races, and that's kind of how it was used initially. It's to say this is an argument to say that this race is the superior race and then everybody else. So in that sense, it was a socially constructed concept of actually order and hierarchy. And I guess for me, I don't often use the term race. I tend to go with culture. And then in terms of particularity, I would then use ethnicity. So I would say that I'm Pacifica, so I'm part of the Pacifica culture, but ethnically I'm Rutuman because that's my particularity. I prefer culture in the sense that it's more embracing, in that it's not just looking at what defines you as a particular race, but more that there are many other things that define you as a culture and as a person. So that's kind of, when I've talked about it, I've always kind of talked more in terms of culture, and if I need to, in terms of ethnicity. But it's interesting because as you were asking me that question, I thought, but when you kind of see race being used, it's actually being used as a weapon against someone. rather than, as you say, something that's inclusive, you know. So every time the word race comes up, it's like, oh yeah, here we go. It's being used in a negative sense to define the other, whatever that, yeah. So I think this is a journey that's, that's opening up and emerging. I'm not, and you know, I'm thinking here, this is probably something in anthropology that might be opening up a lot more than it is in theology. But yeah, definitely, it's something that ought to be sort of explored further and more meaningfully. So it's a really good question. Thank you. I might need to go away now and think, how can I research this thing? Yeah.
Just wondering how natural racism is. If I'll give you an example, I live down the road here, and near my house is a dog park. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Is a dog park, and I've been going there for a few years, and there's a number of little dogs that get there that look like they're brothers and sisters. They're little ones that this high. I don't know if they are related, but they look of the same genes, and they have conflict with large black dogs. They don't like them, and they only seem to like each other. And I'm thinking, wow, how
natural is
that?
that?
And just talking about Jesus, my understanding about Jesus, when the Romans took him on, they made him look like their previous god Jupiter, with a long beard and long hair. I don't know if he actually looked like that in the Middle East, but the Romans made him look like that, and they gave his birthday the same day that they were honouring Jupiter, the 25th of December. That was Jupiter's day before. So, you know, it just seems natural, doesn't it, that people want to find and how much is your imprinting powerful in determining your future? My earliest memories are of being in the bed in a sanatorium on the Yorkshire moors, and the earliest memories is looking to my right at nurses putting thermometers in my mouth, white nurses, and I believe that imprinting has made me love Anglo-Saxon women. It's the only ones I've ever fallen in love with. So how powerful. If I'd come out of my mother's body and was given to a black African woman, I would just be loving of black African women. It's so powerful, those early years.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned the doctrine of discovery. I'm not familiar with that particular term, so I wondered if you could expand on it.
Sure. Well, the doctrine of discovery came about in the 1400s from the Vatican, and it was a decree that said that Europeans could actually go into other lands and, islands, territories, whereby if people were non-Christian, it could be taken over. So so this is kind of what was behind the whole colonizing, So the people that were on the receiving end of this, and even till today, were mainly the Indigenous peoples. So that's what enabled, the Indigenous peoples of Canada and America, Latin America, and even here in Australia, because it just validated and justified and also legalized the taking of, Indigenous lands.
And it was a real misuse of scripture, sort of going to the
Yes.
Matthew 25, go make disciples of every nation, and sweet, we can go and do that and forcefully put that on any place and take control. Or it's the terra nullius idea of Australia is built in the same idea to say there's no one here that of relevance, we can take it for ourselves.
Thinking about like decolonising ourselves, what are some of the ways in which you see that kind of whiteness or that colonial mindset play out in how we do things, like the way that we meet or the way that we worship, and how might we kind of challenge those things? Like, for example, I think time. Like, I used to work in East Timor, and they were just like, no, it doesn't matter if I'm not there on time. And like, I as a white person was like, no, if a meeting starts at 10, it starts at 10, and like that. I really saw that. Like, are there other ways that we can see that play out, and we might be able to challenge it?
Yeah, and the doing part is really hard. I think one of the important ways is actually relationship building and conversation, and actually having like this. This is where you've opened up space for us to have this conversation, and where I'm bunging on about whiteness and feeling, but it's where there are spaces where we can actually have real conversations, where we can be vulnerable, and we can be angry, but at the same time, we can commit to each other to actually find practical ways of moving forward together. So, and it's something that needs to be done over and over again. It's not, we can't just meet and overnight things change. It's also, if we're looking at the Uniting Church, like this is the 40th year of the statement that the Uniting Church made, that we are a multicultural church. And this is an area of ministry, and this is where I'm going to rant, where we talk a lot about it. We're 40 years on. We're going to mark the anniversary in June, and we're still struggling for resources to do it. And we kept getting told that there are other priorities in the church. And I say to myself and what in the hell did we mean in 1985 when we said we would be this? We also made two other statements after 1985. One body, many parts, and the other is being the household of God for all, God's church for all. So, like these are documents, statements that we've made as a church that are part of our DNA, and yet we keep marginalising them. So what is it that we need to do as a church? And I think part of it is also addressing our constitution. It's also looking at our theology of the UCA, looking at the basis of union, and actually doing a lot more integrating than we've ever done. So because at the moment we're compartmentalising. So you got multicultural church over here. I don't like that term, but we'll use it because that was the original statement. You got covenanting happening over here, and somehow we're struggling to bring all those aspects together. Synod has 6 directions. How are they one? I mean, at the moment, we're silos. So, again, there's a broader conversation needing to happen there about our identity as the Uniting Church, rather than compartmentalised, or compete. And that's what happens. You then encourage competing interests, because then everybody in these different fields are actually going to compete for resources, and may the strong one win. And I really don't want a church like that. I'd love to be able to see a church that's able to hold all those things together as our common identity. So, so that's kind of like the big level kind of thing. But I think as congregations, what you're doing here, from what I've seen reading your website, is actually a great start. And it is also, it can serve as an example to other congregations who may want to actually be intentional about this journey. It's like, oh wow, well this is what Like Heart Uniting Church is doing. How might we do it here? So, but it is, because we are so much part, and I mean, I catch myself every now and then thinking something and going, oh gosh, I've just defaulted to, this time thing. I like time, I like people to be on time, It's like, and then I go, and every now and then I have to sort of stop and say, well, what's going on here? Rather than say, well, this is how it will be. Because for all of us living in this space, Australia, and for those of us who've come to live by choice in the diaspora, there's a whole lot of conversation and compromising and negotiation that needs to be made so that we can maintain our unity and yet feel that our diversity is still intact. So, not very practical there, but...
I think it also goes back to what you said earlier around that question, or what are we actually willing to give up in that space? And I remember going to my first National Assembly meeting of the Uniting Church and participating in a meeting where we have the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress as an active part of that participation, and then finding that there were in place different rules with how they would engage with the meeting. And so in terms of if I was to go and ask a question about a particular proposal, I'd have a set time limit, whereas if a UAICC member was asking a question, they wouldn't have a time limit. They also had the power to stop the meeting so that they could go and talk themselves together, and the meeting couldn't continue without them. And I remember experiencing that for the first time, actually being quite shocked and quite, I don't know if offended is the right word, but thinking, why are we doing this? Like, why are we letting this happen to have these different ways of us meeting? And it wasn't until sort of talking to far wiser people than I, realising how Anglo our meeting styles are, and how much it is that makes all of the way we meet makes sense to a particular cultural identity, and the actual, what we're offering in that space is actually so small to try and accommodate. I think we should be doing so much more, but that was what we were willing to give up in that space. And so there always has to be that question for us: what else are we willing to give up to actually engage with others in the way that they might interact with the world?
Yeah, and I mean, it's as you were talking, I was thinking, looking at the space, it's also how we arrange spaces in churches. That's important. Like, we might not think it's important, but it is, because it can give a sense to someone of whether or not they can feel they belong, or whether they are welcomed. So, space organisation is important. The kind of language that you use in your liturgies, the songs that you sing, they're all important. The prayers that you say. And it's not just about having different languages, and different Bible readings in different languages. It's more than that. It's about participation and everyone feeling that they can have a voice in the conversation and that they can contribute to the conversation. Yep.
Can you say more, Sef, about your the feeling you had about the term multicultural? You meant just offhandedly, you kind of went, I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah. Look, names define who we are. So the multicultural in 1985 was perhaps the best term for the time. I feel it's more of a very political, secular term. It's a term that's been used, that's what we use. And it also, multicultural for me kind of just says, well, you're just describing the reality. Of course we are a multicultural church, right? We're different people, different cultures, and I'm using culture in a very broad sense, being part of this multicultural church. But we want to be more than that. We want to be a church. I mean, my sort of preference is to use cross-cultural because it has a leaning, more of a leaning towards a theological basis than, say, intercultural and multicultural do. So, and the thing is, we haven't developed a strong enough theology behind the terms. So we're just rattling it off like, we're multicultural, cross-cultural, intercultural, but where's our theology behind that? What is the theology that's giving power and fuel to the term, where we as a church can go, that's what I know it means, and I'm this because that's part of my discipleship. So I think multicultural is one that just says we're living together, but we're not doing anything much. We're eating each other's food. Actually, someone described multiculturalism, this was funny, I thought it was funny, as cannibalism, you know, simply because we're just eating each other's food. So we're, you know, and that's where it stops. Nothing happens. We just eat each other and say yum yum, and that's it.
It's funny and also.
I know, it is funny and gross.
Thanks, Seth and Adrian, for the conversation. One thing that's often concerned me is that we can use all these terms and we can think we're doing the right thing in congregations and all the rest of it, and then we're having to deal with a synod that has all these processes that never think about doing things in different ways.
Yep.
And that's always concerned me, especially when you are addressing particular issues for different groups of people, and there's literally a cut-off and no conversation. And I wonder, at what stage, and I don't want to call them the upper echelons or whatever, but at what stage do people who are working in different fields sit down and talk about processes? Because it seems to be the processes that are often sidelining people in different ways.
Yeah. Yep, it's a good question, Carolyn, and one that needs to be asked time and time again. But again, one where I think we just find it very hard to do, and I think it comes back down to what we're willing to give up in terms of privilege and power. It's also about leadership and the skills and competencies that leadership have to actually make spaces for those conversations and the intentionality to engage in those processes. So I know I get frustrated because, as you say, we do a lot of talking, a lot of good talking, and we say wonderful things, but it's when the rubber hits the road, it's where we're failing, and it just seems like we keep coming to that point and we don't move on. But you're so right. It's processes and ways of doing things differently that's culturally sensitive and aware. Yeah.
We'll go Kerry next.
Thank you. I'm just new back in the, never been part of the Uniting Church, but I was in the Methodist Church 150 years ago. It really was.
You're looking well.
But, and we were part of Methodist youth. There were about 40 young adults who went over to Timor to work on a project. And we worked for 2 years on that, on fundraising. And at the end of it, the person who was heading it up said that we have no rights to be able to say how that money was spent. Now that was 2 years and a lot of money. He said this is completely for the people of that area to decide, which was West Timor at that time, their decision. And it wasn't for us to say, no, we don't want this, or we do want this. They had to decide how that money was going to be spent. And that was one of the pivotal lessons that I learned at that time that I have sought to apply through whatever I have done subsequently. I think that that's one of the really big things, that we listen to the people involved and actually expect them to be able to do things their way not the way that we feel comfortable often, because we've got entrenched ways of doing things whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And I just look back on that young man, because he wasn't much older than we were, who had such wisdom. And I think what you're saying there about processes and so on, it's a lot of decisions are being made financially for me as an observer to see appalling decisions that are being made that local communities have been really distressed about. And it's that kind of thing. If Synod is able to break open the practices of learned behaviour,
Yeah.
then this dream might actually come into being, because it's what many people want. It's how we live in our communities. And really, it's not that hard.
And in many ways, you kind of need the courage, actually, to make it happen. Intentionality and courage. You know, the intention to do what needs to be done and the courage to actually do it. Yeah. Otherwise, we keep defaulting. I mean, you know, this is the thing. We just keep defaulting because the default position is easier. You know, it just is. Like, and we all kind of fall into the default position, but it's not life-giving and life-affirming for everybody. For some, maybe. Yeah.
So, my question is about, is there a place for evangelism in a decolonized sort of theology? Like, what might that look like? And I come from a place where I was raised American Southern Baptist, and like that. I mean, it's that like if you can convert someone, that's like the best thing you can do. And I haven't even been able to think about evangelism now, like the word, thinking about the process, like it just kind of makes me all icky.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering, like, how do you think about that? Does it need to be like just kicked out of the park, or what? Yeah.
Definitely, there's a space and a necessity to not only decolonize but to reframe what evangelism means. For example, the World Council of Churches has a document on that in relation to people of other faiths, because that's where it gets really, because it's like, no, they're all going to hell. So if we don't evangelize them, they don't hear the good news, there's no hope for them. So, so the WCC has done work on reframing evangelism and sort of broadening the understanding of Christian witness in terms of relationships, rather than, going in and actually say, you must become Christian. The Uniting Church has a document, and there was one, Living with the Neighbour Who is Different, again looking at different ways of understanding evangelism and also working with and relating to, building relationships with people of other faiths. They followed it up with another document where friendship was the theological concept. In both these documents, there is a clear paragraph that says that it is not us who does the conversion, it is the Spirit that does the converting. So part of our Christian witness is to share the good news, but to allow the Spirit to move in ways that the Spirit determines or that the Spirit sees fit. That it is not our job to actually say, you must become this. It's a misinterpretation of the Matthew 28 commandment. So there's been, that kind of work. And also the Matthew 28, 20 scripture has also been, subverted and also deconstructed in terms of that commandment about, what was it that Jesus asked us to do? To, love your neighbour and to love God as yourself. That is the commandment. The commandment was not to go into, the world and to make people like you. And that's been the whole thing around the colonizing process, is that the message got distorted where the you was interpreted as the one taking the message. And I think that was, for me, a very helpful way of looking at that, understanding what it means to, understand that verse that says, and to make them more like me. And that me is Jesus. It's not the one taking the message, which we have so misinterpreted and become. And I think that in many ways is the motivating force that makes us want to convert people, because really you're saying, but if they don't become a Christian, whose problem is that? It's not ours to actually solve or resolve. And so this whole thing too about people of other faiths is to recognise that, we can be faithful in our Christian witness, but they may just choose not to become Christian. And that's the work of the Spirit, to actually leave it. So, yes, of course, many exciting ways to actually reframe that conversation.
I think something that's helped me in that space is to understand that what often is understood as evangelism isn't actually evangelism, it's proselytism. And that's a sense of, it's a coercive sense of, I am the holder of truth and I'm giving that truth to you, and there is no relationship in what that is. And that's problematic, and that is the I'm going to convert you mentality is. Evangelism, it's not our job to do the conversion, it's our job to share a story that has changed our lives. And God can do what God will with that. And to be open to the opportunity to be changed ourselves. I think that's the other miss part of when we talk about evangelism, is that we see it as a one-way street. It's me evangelizing to you. What do we receive from those that we share with? What is changing in their lives that we might share in and participate in? And there's that level of vulnerability that we don't want to go into at all. We don't want to be changed. We want to change other people, but to do that authentically, we need to build relationship, and we need to be open to change ourselves.
Seth, in your experience, how does tokenism happen, and how do we move beyond it?
Oh, yeah, that's let me start by saying this is like, someone once said to me, two examples, and it kind of relates, it sort of relates to tokenism, but it doesn't. But let me get there. One person once said to me, do you think you get asked to speak at different things because you're brown? Right? To which I'm thinking, wow, I would hope that, it's because I've worked hard to do this research. But that was, another was a person saying to me, you actually didn't get that theology lecturer's job. This was the first one at UTC, because you don't have systematic theology in your DNA. So there's a lot of, so this is what I'm saying, where racism, and these are from people who are active leaders in the church. So, perhaps in their eyes, they're thinking you're token. So you get spaces and places because you're a brown Pacifica woman, and we don't actually have, So I would hope that we could move beyond tokenism, in the sense that when we're looking at representation, and representation is not about having, like a set number of coloured bodies on a committee. It's actually about looking for the right people in those bodies, because we do need that representation. But it should not be because we need someone and therefore you're brown, you'll do. And then I think there's also there's also, of course, politics involved in who we choose to be on these committees, and tokenism comes into play because we like you, you're the brown body, you're nice, you don't challenge the system. So, you'll do. I would really, really hope that we could move beyond that, but we are human beings and the church is full of human beings, and we always go for what's easy and for what will maintain the status quo. And usually, for me, it comes back to a power privilege thing, because it's the power that determines or that wants to hold and determines what happens in a particular space or place. So, of course, they're going to choose like-minded people who will say yes to the agenda, other than people who can truly contribute and challenge stuff. Yep.
This is like the conch and Lord of the Flies. Look,
Thanks, Andrew.
it's wonderful hearing all. There's so much that you've said that resonates with things that I, in my mind, I wanted just a couple of comments on Fiji, because I wonder about racism within the Pacific, because I wonder whether the Fijians were racist towards the Ratumans or where the Samoans come into it. But on a positive note, it's interesting the Tongans are really exploring their own university education. They don't want to have any contact with Western or whiteness, to use your term. They want to, what is higher learning in their experience? So that's just a comment. The other one I wanted to say, Seth, was I'm teaching a bit of UCS at the moment, United Church Studies, to an individual, and I can't help but seeing in all the United Church documents this huge range, this huge diversity, and you've alluded to it when you talk about covenanting and multiculturalism, but the thing is, how do you integrate diversity?
Yeah.
How can, I mean, I think the beauty of the Uniting Church, through the years, we've had failures, but we've had successes, is we have embraced this diversity, but you seem to be saying, well, hang on a minute, I don't like the fact that one's there and one's there, but how can we integrate them and maintain the beauty of each individual?
I keep asking that question, Andrew, and I'm probably gonna be killed for this, but anyway.
We can edit it out later.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think part of it is about decentering the power base, and I think that within the Uniting Church, our structures are still very much centred around a white kind of power base. And until we can decenter that, I don't think we're going to have much change. Because you actually, I think, need a different kind of thinking that comes into play about how we are church.
So we're pilgrim people on the way.
Yeah.
So how are we going to do that, sir?
Well, you're going to have to start...
Are we on the right path to do that?
I hope so. Part of it is looking at our leadership of the church and finding people with the right skills and competencies who can bring about those changes. I don't know how we choose our leaders. I mean, I don't know. But, things like general secretaries, and I think that's a work that we as people of God, like in our own synod, should be investing in. We don't have a contingency plan, right? It's like someone resigns and then someone either gets tapped on the shoulder or they can't find someone and someone gets into the role who may not be the best person for the role. So we keep perpetuating the same. But we need a new kind of energy and a new vision that, and we need to actually grow that, because some people have it naturally, but they still need the mentoring to do that. We don't do mentoring of leaders. To actually say, I think you have gifts for this leadership and this ministry, we don't invest in that. So I think we're still politicking around, who's the most popular person at the moment. But I think it is being intentional and being strategic about how we mentor leadership into the future. And we're not doing that. Because our head's not in that space.
Got time for one or two more questions?
1.5 hours is really long, isn't it?
I think for us, but they're probably going, we want more, so.
I'll ask a short question so you have a long answer. Can you say a little bit more about liberation theology as an inspiration specifically in Australia? Like what would that look like here, or how do you think about it?
Yeah. Okay. So I said earlier that liberation theology is about political liberation of the oppressed and the marginalised and the poor, and it is also about justice and equality. So one of the things that's integral to liberation theology is changes in systems and structures, so policies. So in terms of doing liberation, and we've been talking around that in this conversation. So what it does mean is that you have to either dismantle structures you have to dismantle structures and ways of thinking that actually then also change your policies, your theologies, so it actually requires a conversion in thinking. It's the transformation of the mind. So it's what Carolyn has said, you're going to have to do things differently. You need to do it differently in order to actually bring about transformation and justice. Because if you don't do things differently than the way it's being done now, there'll never be justice or liberation or equality for all. So it's not about cosmetic changes. And this is what I worry about the Uniting Church, is we do a lot of cosmetic changes, right? But we actually don't touch the things that in our structures that really need to be changed to effect transformation, justice, and equality for all, so that we can change the processes and ways of doing things. So that's what liberation theology tells us and reminds us, that it's not just about saying we have a space at the table. It's about saying we need to change the systems and structures in place in order to effect the transformation that God calls forth out of us and out of the church.
Go to Sharon.
Hi. I would say this is a bit more like reflection or commentary, so I'm free for you to comment whatever this is. Because when I was just listening to you speak, I was reflecting on my experience where I grew up in a different multicultural country, but in a language-based church, particularly a Chinese Mandarin-based church. And I knew that when I was growing up, my Mandarin was terrible, still is. It's just that the people around me, aside from that, we still have a white Jesus and the signboards and the pews and whatnot. It was very amusing at that point. But it just felt like everyone around me was in some version of Chinese diaspora. Didn't really seem like there were a variety of people to mingle with. People had a similar culture, similar background. And I'm just wondering at this point, sometimes is language a barrier or is language an accessibility?
You're talking about different languages? Yeah. So is it a barrier or is it... Sorry.
Yeah, as in like, sometimes I feel that can language be a barrier for people to feel higher or maybe better in quotation marks, giant quotation marks, than the other, or does it feel like an accessibility? Maybe just your thoughts about language and
right.
languages in this case. Sorry, very convoluted.
No. Language is important, especially if you're living in a very diverse, multicultural, intercultural, cross-cultural space. One is that it is important, I know, for cultures to maintain their languages because it's part of their identity, but for the sake of their third, fourth generations, their children need to learn the language that's part of the particular country. So, so in some cases, I think it's like holding the balance. Like on the one hand, we need to celebrate that diversity of which language is part. On the other, we need to communicate. So either we go with the main language, like for us, it's English, or we find ways of enabling other people to participate in their own languages. So we invest in interpretation, or is that what you call it, where you speak? Yeah, that's what it is. Interpretation. In the World Council of Churches, for example, like they got 350 member churches. They all don't come from English-speaking countries, but they decided that they would use English as the main medium of communicating, but they have 4 other languages that they say that they will, support in terms of interpretation. So they are French, Spanish, I think Russian was one, although I wasn't quite sure whether that still is, and I've forgotten the 4th one. But they made a choice to say, we need to communicate with each other. These are the kind of English is the medium, and then we'll have 4 others because, they represent the membership, the major membership churches and areas and languages that they speak. So that's a way that they do it. So they actually have, in the meeting room, they will have an interpreter. That's it. It's, so I think, and it's interesting that you asked that because it's very much like those of us who come from diverse cultures, it's an issue. The other thing is I lived in Geneva for 3 years, and it was when I understood 2 things. In Geneva, it's in French-speaking canton. They actually tell you up front, you need to learn French to keep your visa. I'm terrible at languages. But I learned how to order my coffee in French. But they just tell you, that's the way it is, right? That you've got to learn this because, and if you choose to live in that country, you have to speak French whether you like it or not. So I learned 2 things. One was the importance of language, and when I think about Australia, I think about how hard it is for some of our migrants to speak English, and therefore, if they don't speak English or read English, how hard it is for them to actually read documents and understand Australian society. Because I couldn't read French. And I'm needing to sign, Raph and I were needing to sign things like your flat lease. And I couldn't, so we're using Google. Google doesn't always tell you everything. It's the missing nuances, and we actually got caught on that with our rent because it said, you could stay 3 years and then you can leave after that. But what we didn't get, the nuance we didn't get was, but it's on the date in which, the anniversary on which you actually got the lease. So we had to pay for 3 months' rent. Because that was the law, and we weren't in the place because we left in December, and it was due. We left in November, and the rental went up to February. So so there's that thing. Now, in saying that, sometimes I think, and we did it in Australia, where we use language as a way to keep certain others out. So they used to do the dictation test in immigration, and then give you some foreign language that even some people, like Greek, how in the hell are you going to read something in Greek when you're not Greek? So sometimes it's what countries and governments use to keep certain people out. But I guess coming back to who we are as church, if it's going to be a challenge and an issue, then we also have to address that, because that's also part of our process of being together. You can't have someone go to a synod meeting and can't communicate because they just don't understand what's going on. So does that help unpack some things? Or?
As we wrap up, what question were you expecting to be asked today that you didn't get asked?
I think I got asked just
about
everything,
okay.
Yeah.
Excellent, well done.
And
more, hopefully.
Yes, and more. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to put myself out there because it might be a question I don't have an answer to. So
Wonderful. Can we please show appreciation for Seth for today?
Thank you.